In Memphis, sailors stood on the decks of Union gunboats, watching the red glow from the dying steamer. However, no rescue effort was launched until approximately 2:30 in the morning, almost half an hour after the explosion. The Bostonia II, a passenger steamboat on her maiden voyage after being refurbished, came upon the burning Sultana and immediately began hauling in survivors from the water. Alerted by the screaming of victims being carried along the river, boats put out from nearby Mound City, Memphis, and small settlements in between. Other vessels joined the rescue efforts, including the steamers Silver Spray, Jenny Lind, and Pocahontas, the Navy ironclad USS Essex, and the side-wheel gunboat USS Tyler. As cutters from the gunboats began sweeping the river in front of Memphis for survivors, their crews were directed in the darkness by cries for help. A sailor aboard the USS Tyler wrote in the ship's log that, quote, "Of all the sounds and noises I ever heard, that was the most sorrowful. Some cursing, calling for help, and shrieking. I will never forget those awful sounds." Some of the rescuers were able to haul in gasping survivors suffering various stages of hypothermia. Some victims were plucked from the tops of semi-submerged trees. Other rescuers spent frantic, futile minutes trying to locate voices calling for help that grew fainter and then fell silent. Among those that were saved was the engineer on duty when the boilers exploded, who would live just long enough to make a deathbed statement about what had transpired. The fire on the Sultana soon died down enough that survivors clinging to the boat's hull were able to haul themselves back on board. There, they fought the lingering flames and tried to ignore the sight of burnt bodies. With the help of some survivors riding small boats in the water, the Sultana's wreckage was secured to a clump of trees after drifting about 6 miles or 10 kilometers to the west bank of the Mississippi. But the fire raged on, eventually forcing those still on board to jump onto rafts or clamber into the trees to escape. Finally, the flames succumbed to the cold river waters that rose over the charred hull. The Sultana sank at approximately 7 a.m., about 5 hours after the explosion, on a bar near Mound City, present-day Marion, Arkansas. More than 500 of those who made it to shore were placed in hospitals. The soldiers' home at Memphis took another 241. Many of these injured did not live to enjoy the freedom that they had only recently won. Sergeant William Fies of the 64th Ohio Infantry Regiment, describing the grim sights in one of the hospital wards, wrote that he, quote, was placed in a ward with quite a number who were severely scalded, or otherwise badly injured, and such misery and intense suffering as I witnessed while there is beyond my power to describe. The agonizing cries and groans of the burned and scalded were heartrending, and almost unendurable. But in most cases, the suffering was of short duration, as most of them were relieved by death in a few hours. All those who would survive the disaster were located within the first 12 hours of the explosion. By morning, more than 1,700 people were either dead or dying. Of the hundreds being treated at local hospitals, only 31 passed away. The residents of Memphis had sympathy for the victims despite the ongoing Union occupation. The Chicago Opera Troupe, a minstrel group that had traveled upriver on Sultana before getting off at Memphis, staged a benefit performance to raise money for the injured. All the while, the crew of the gunboat Essex raised $1,000 for the cause, equivalent to $19,904 in 2023. Body recovery would take months, passing into the second week of May. Some of the dead were discovered as far as 120 miles south of Memphis, and some as far as Vicksburg. Many bodies were simply never recovered, such as that of the Sultana's very own Captain Mason. In 1880, the War Department placed the number of survivors at 931. Dead soldiers were interred at the Fort Pickering Cemetery, located on the south shore of Memphis. A year later, when the U.S. government established the Memphis National Cemetery on the northeast side of the city, many of the bodies were moved there. Between 783 and 786 of the crew and passengers survived. Because no accurate assessment of the number of passengers was made beforehand, it was impossible to calculate the exact number of dead. Both the military's estimate of 1,238 and the Customs Department's figure of 1,547 were based strictly on a tally of prisoners placed on the Sultana at Vicksburg and were, therefore, too low. Later recalculations by historians suggest a number closer to 1,800. By comparison, the fatalities far outweighed those of RMS Titanic, whose own sinking would occur almost 50 years later, leading to the loss of some 1,517 people. To this day, the explosion and sinking of the SS Sultana remains the worst maritime disaster in American history and is routinely listed among the top 10 ever in the world. As the Civil War had only just ended, many northern newspapers immediately cited Confederate sabotage as the cause of the tragedy. However, this possibility was discounted by all of the various military investigations that followed. Within hours of the disaster, General C.C. Washburn, the commanding officer at Memphis, appointed a military commission to investigate the tragedy. Weeks of testimony made the commission discount the crowded conditions aboard the Sultana, concluding that, quote, "The evidence fully shows that the government has transferred as many or more troops on boats of no greater capacity than the Sultana, frequently and with safety." The Washburn Commission concluded that insufficient water in the boilers precipitated the explosion. This was despite testimony to the contrary by the Sultana's second engineer, who was on watch at the time of the explosion and who died soon after from the injuries he received. Both General Dana and Brigadier General William Hoffman, the U.S. Army Commissary General of Prisoners, also conducted investigations. Hoffman's findings were the most critical of the military's involvement in the Sultana tragedy. He concluded that the, quote, "shipment of so large a number of troops on one boat was, under the circumstances, unnecessary, unjustifiable, and a great outrage on the troops." Ultimately, only one officer was ever brought to trial for his involvement in the affair, Captain Frederick Speed, who was charged with neglect of duty, leading to the overcrowding of the Sultana. Speed pled not guilty. However, following 6 months of legal and judicial considerations, he was found guilty, but then had his verdict overturned by the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General. The latter's reasoning was that Speed had been at the parole camp all day and had not personally placed a single soldier aboard Sultana. Ironically, the reverse decision made a point of the fact that while the Sultana might have been overcrowded, she was not overloaded. Captain Hatch, who had concocted a bribe with Captain Mason to bring as many men onto Sultana as possible, had quickly resigned his commission to avoid a court-martial and then had gone into hiding. Hatch had originally kept his job through political connections. He was the younger brother of Illinois politician Ozias M. Hatch, an advisor and close friend of President Lincoln. After the disaster, he was given 3 separate subpoenas to appear before Captain Speed's trial to give testimony. However, he died in 1871, having escaped justice because of his numerous, highly placed patrons. In the end, no one was ever held accountable for what remains the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. Opinions still differ regarding the cause of the explosion. In 1888, an article appeared in a St. Louis newspaper recounting a conversation in a saloon between a St. Louis resident named William Streeter and an ex-Confederate agent and saboteur named Robert Loudon, who claimed credit for the Sultana disaster. Loudon said that his means of sabotage was an explosive device designed as a lump of coal, a coal torpedo, and that he had managed to slip aboard during the coaling stop outside of Memphis. It is known that he operated in and around St. Louis and had even perpetrated the burning of the steamboat Ruth. Additionally, what appeared to be a piece of an artillery shell was said to have been recovered from the sunken wreck. However, his connection to the Sultana is completely circumstantial. The explosion occurred from the top rear of the boilers and far away from the fireboxes, indicating that Loudon's claim of using an exploding coal torpedo in the firebox below the front part of the boilers was unlikely. The Vicksburg patch job has also been suggested as the cause, although the deathbed testimony of the engineer on duty was that there was no loss of pressure in the minutes leading up to the explosion. Even so, the most likely scenario points to the boiler itself. Given the unstable nature of the human load on board and the turbulent waters below, it is highly likely that the Sultana careened frequently, listing from side to side. With the engine requiring maximum steam pressure to maintain its headway against the heavy flood current, the need to keep sufficient water levels in the boilers was critical. Her 4 boilers were interconnected and mounted side by side, so that if the boat tipped sideways, water would tend to run out of the highest boiler. The fires, still going against the empty boiler, would have created hotspots. When the boat tipped the other way, water rushing back into the empty boiler would hit these hotspots and flash instantly into steam, creating a sudden surge in pressure. It would not have taken long for the red-hot piping, suddenly flushed by cold river water, to cause a fatigue rupture in one boiler, which would, incidentally, set off 2 more. This effect of careening could have been minimized by maintaining high water levels in the boilers. The official inquiry found that the boilers exploded because of the combined effects of careening, low water levels, and the faulty repair made a few days earlier. The disaster went almost immediately overlooked and ignored by the public, overshadowed in the press by events surrounding the end of the Civil War, including the hunting down and killing of President Abraham Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, just the day prior, and the journey of President Lincoln's funeral train. Compared to a conflict whose death toll had risen to well over 600,000, at the time, the loss of fewer than 2,000 American lives seemed almost negligible. It was relegated to little more than a footnote on the final chapter of the bloodiest age in U.S. history. Few would truly pay any attention to the travesty, save for the families of the victims who were learning day by day of the fate of their loved ones, one unexpected death notice at a time. As for the Sultana herself, the shifting of Mississippi River channels over the past 150 years has caused her watery grave to be turned into an earthen one. In 1982, a local archaeological expedition uncovered what is believed to be the wreckage of Sultana. It was found about 32 feet or 10 meters under a soybean field in Crittenden County in Arkansas, about 4 miles or 6 kilometers from Memphis, and about 2 miles or 3 kilometers east of the Mississippi's main channel. The wreck itself is little more than a collection of charred wooden deck planks and a scattering of metal pieces. Today, there are just a few small monuments here and there mentioning the Sultana in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. There are 2 in Ohio and 1 in Indiana. However, no national memorial was ever made. As for the survivors, in December 1885, those living in the northern states of Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio began attending annual reunions, forming the National Sultana Survivors Association and meeting in Toledo, Ohio. Possibly inspired by their northern counterparts, a southern group of survivors, men from Tennessee and Kentucky, began meeting in 1889 around Knoxville, Tennessee. Both groups met as close to the April 27th anniversary date as possible. They corresponded with each other and eventually shared the title National Sultana Survivors Association together. By the mid-1920s, only a handful of survivors could attend the reunions in Knoxville. The last overall survivor was Private Charles M. Eldridge of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry Regiment, who died at his home at age 96 on September 8, 1941, more than 76 years after the disaster, and just a few months shy of America's entry into an altogether larger conflict. And even then, the horrors experienced by those who lived on in the wake of the disaster would never fully go away, leaving behind a legacy of sudden tragedy, blatant injustice, and harrowing survival. Would to God that I could forever blot from memory and sight the events of that terrible disaster, said Ohioan George Hayes in 1888, but they cling to me like a horrible nightmare, even visiting me in my dreams, as well as in my waking moments.